Now from Mark chapter 8, verses 11 to 21. Mark chapter 8, verses 11 to 21. The Pharisees came and began to question Jesus. To test him, they asked him for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply and said, "Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly, I tell you, no sign will be given to it." Then he left them, got back into the boat, and crossed to the other side. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for one loaf they had with them in the boat. "Be careful," Jesus warned them. "Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod." They discussed this with one another and said, "It is because we have no bread." Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" 12, they replied. "And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" They answered, 7. He said to them, "Do you still not understand?"
The disciples thought they were in trouble. See, they'd only brought 1 loaf of bread, and they were going somewhere with Jesus. And when Jesus started to talk about yeast, they put these 2 things together. They thought, yeast, bread. We should have bought more bread. But of course, Jesus had just fed 4,000 people, probably a lot more actually, because it was 4,000 men plus everybody else with 7 loaves. So 1 loaf was definitely going to be enough for a few disciples. Jesus was talking about something else. He was talking about yeast. That substance that's very small. It goes into a loaf of bread and then you can't see it, but it influences the whole loaf as the loaf rises. Jesus was talking about the influence that the Pharisees and Herod had on people, on ordinary people, on the multitudes of ordinary people who every day had to live up to their expectations. And when Jesus met the Pharisees, as he did often, as recorded in the Gospels, he continually pointed out their hypocrisy. The fact that they would say one thing and do another, or think one thing and say another. There was no integrity, only hypocrisy. But you know, the Pharisees were smart people. They were the best of the best. They were intelligent. And they had good intentions as well. You know, they really did want to please God. So how did these people who were intelligent and had good intentions, how did they end up becoming hypocritical? Well, it starts in a place called legalism. You see, what the Pharisees had done is they'd taken the law, which God had given, and they had grown it and expanded it and interpreted it to the extent that they actually had 613 rules that you had to live by. Now that's a lot of rules. It's a lot of laws. Because they wanted to cover the whole of life. And they insisted that in order to please God, you needed to keep all 613 of these rules. And some of them were very petty. I mean, when Jesus and his disciples were going through the cornfields on a Sabbath, and they plucked an ear of corn, the Pharisees wouldn't let them do that, because they had a law that said, you can't do that. Legalism, law, rule. And what had happened is the laws that had been given, instead of being a means to an end, became the end in itself. So people would be judged as to whether they obeyed the rules. But when God gave the law in the first place, he didn't give it just so you could obey it. He gave it because that's what would help the community flourish. That's what would ensure that everybody can thrive. Nobody would get left out. That was the purpose of the law. But the Pharisees had lost that purpose, and they made the obedience to the rules the end game. That's what legalism is. And of course, legalism turned into judgmentalism, because when you have a set of laws and a set of rules that have to be obeyed, everybody gets judged according to whether they obey them. And nobody could live up to it. Nobody could live up to that. The sinners, of course, were sinners. The tax collectors, the prostitutes, the lepers. Even Jesus couldn't live up to it. I mean, that's the point. He couldn't be the Messiah. How could he be the Messiah if he didn't obey the 613 laws? It wasn't possible. And so they became judgmental. But as we all know, we don't judge others in the same way we judge ourselves. We judge others by their actions, but we tend to judge ourselves by our intentions. If someone is late, we judge them because their action of lateness isn't there. But when we're late, we give ourselves an excuse because we never intended to be late. We always judge others by their actions and ourselves by our intentions. So legalism turns into judgmentalism and into self-justification. We have a reason to justify our own behavior because we're the ones who keep the law. We're the ones who keep the rules. Jesus told a story, didn't he, of two people who went up to the temple to pray. And of course, the Pharisee says, I fast twice a week. I give my money to the poor. I do this. I do that. I am justified. I'm not like that other person. I'm justified because I keep to the rules and to the laws. And of course, Jesus said it wasn't the Pharisee who went home justified. It was the man who couldn't even look to heaven, who acknowledged his own weakness, his own brokenness, his own inability to live up to his own expectations, let alone anybody else's. It was that man who went home justified. Legalism turns into judgmentalism. Judgmentalism turns into self-justification. And that's what happens when people become hypocritical. When they become hypocrites, because they become blind. As Jesus pointed out in this very passage, you know, the Pharisees are saying, give us a sign. Well, what's just happened? Jesus has just fed 4,000 people with 7 loaves. Isn't that a bigger sign? Do you want something else? No, they're not able to see. They've become blinded to their own dysfunctionality because they base their life on the law, on rules and regulations. And of course, Jesus offers something different. He says, come to me. He says, I am the bread of life. He says, if you're weary, if you're heavy burdened, if you struggle to live up to the expectations that people place on you, come to me. Come to me. Believe in me. Trust me. Follow me. And you will find life. My yoke, Jesus says, is light. It's not heavy. It's not like the heavy burden which the Pharisees placed on the ordinary people who couldn't live up to it. All those 613 laws. Jesus says, no. My burden is very light. And if you trust me, you will find life. And of course, on the occasion we're going to remember now, Jesus took another loaf of bread while they were celebrating the Passover, and he broke it and he infused into it new significance. This isn't just a loaf of bread. This is symbolic of the fact that I'm going to give my body. I'm going to be broken for you to heal your brokenness. And then Jesus took a glass of wine and he infused that with new meaning. As he said, this is symbolic of a new covenant. Not a covenant of law, but a covenant of love. So as we come and share in communion this morning, we're invited. We're not condemned. We're not put down because we don't keep the 613 laws or whatever else. We're invited into a meal and into a relationship and into that place Jesus calls life.